From Up in the Clouds, it's your good friend Whimsy Rainbow Star, and these are the Bayonetta 2 accessories. I actually began the entire Bayonetta process by starting with the gloves. I used existing patterns that I had made for other designs previously, mainly the gloves from the Bayonetta 1 cosplay. The first step is to trace my existing patterns onto a new sheet of paper. For these gloves, I wanted to make them easy to remove for using my hands, so while they appear to be full-length gloves, they actually consist of 3 separate items, 4 if you include the chains. The first piece I worked on were the gloves themselves, so I cut a pattern for short gloves with a different colored palm. Next comes the sleeve of the glove, which is a simple tapered rectangle pattern. The third piece is the thumb of the glove, which has to be cut out of 2 different fabrics. Now I begin work on the frilly cuffs of the gloves, which are a bit tricky. My method was to cut 4 rings in a large size and 4 in a smaller size, 2 of each size per cuff. The smaller ring of fabric will be the top piece, while the larger ring will be the piece that drapes over the hand. The inner part of each ring is equal to half the circumference of my wrist, plus a ½ inch of seam allowance on both sides. The fabric used here was different than the actual glove fabric. I used a softer fabric that would ruffle nicely, while the gloves were made of spandex. After figuring that out, I began cutting out the actual glove pieces. Then comes the difficulty of pinning the gloves together. This gets a bit tricky due to all the small angles coupled with the separate palms. For pinning the cuffs, I want to take 2 of the rings of equal size and pin them together at both ends of where they were slit through, and I do this for all of the rings, the small set and the large set. Now comes stitching the pieces. The sleeves are stitched straight and simple using a zigzag and ballpoint needle as usual with stretch fabrics. Then I move on to the cuffs. Once the rings are stitched together at the ends, I match a large piece with a small piece and stitch them together at the innermost ring. Next, I move on to stitching the fingers. For the chain, I had to cut one of them in half to make 2 chain bracelets that sit over the cuffs. Even so, they were not quite long enough, so I had to attach a large lobster clasp to help each one reach in the end. Now I need to make the black leather straps that complete the cuffs and hold the ruffles in place. To do this, I put the cuff on my wrist and measure the circumference of it for an accurate size, where my actual wrist measurement would have been too tight. The fabric I used can be easily drawn on from the wrong side, so I didn't bother with making a pattern and simply measured. I cut 2 of these. Now I have to stitch the straps in place. I stitched each one down in the ends and at the middle, matching where the ruffles seams were. This is mainly to hold the ruffles in place with the straps so they wouldn't fall off. I left the strap open at the end to fit over my wrist easier. To finish the cuffs, I hand-stitched the ruffles in place after having evenly spaced them amidst the strap. I stitched down the top of the cuffs where the smaller ring of the ruffle sits. This step is important because without this stitch, the ruffles will begin slipping down the wrist and under the cuff while worn, and the ruffles won't be evenly distributed. Once that's finished, the gloves are ready to be worn. Making the gloves took a total of 3 hours and 18 minutes. The next accessory I started were the medallions. These took the longest amount of time among the accessory pieces as there was so much cutting to be done and many details. I drew a basic shape on Illustrator to get the dimensions of the medallions. I transferred this stencil to foam and made 12 pieces, 2 per medallion. I cut out the outline first and then cut the holes after. For convenience, and so that they matched, I cut the holes from 2 pieces at a time, making those a matching set. After that, I used a sponge tip on a 4-ounce metallic silver paint bottle to paint one side of each medallion piece. I made sure to keep matching pairs together. For the intricate details in the middle, I decided to basically sandwich the 2 silver pieces over a painted design on transparent acetate sheets. This would prevent any small pieces from getting bent or broken like previous Bayonetta medallions, and could allow the designs to get really fine. I used fine-tipped paint nozzles and metallic gold paint to start the wires of each medallion, following the same pattern for each one by tracing over the thick lines on the paper. This was done 6 times. Once dried, I now take the individual pattern for each medallion and place it under each painted section. The idea at first was to glue one of the outline pieces down before painting, but I discovered, obviously, hot glue will indeed warp the sheets. Let's just say I forgot to test this idea first. Sadly, that medallion was ruined, so I went to using super glue instead, which worked much better. After that, I went and made a 7th set of wires for the medallion I ruined. After the glue dried, I began painting the blue and cyan color details with more metallic paint and precise tips. Once the paint was on, I had to allow the medallion to dry. I then followed the same process for the other 5. When they had dried, I moved on to outlining them with silver. While waiting for that to dry, I spray painted the diamonds I would need for multiple other parts. I put a layer of primer over them to start with. When the primer dried, I used the same metallic blue and a sponge to color them. When the medallions dried, I flipped each one over to repeat the same design on the other side, starting with the gold wires first. Now, before gluing the other side of the outline down, I took a good amount of fishing line to glue in between the pieces. This will be to attach them to lobster clasps to fasten to the mantle, but also so that they may be removed for transit and storage. The line was glued down first, followed then by the outline piece. Once it dried, I traced the colored pieces to the other side, and of course this process was repeated for each medallion. Sponging the diamonds didn't leave a very satisfying texture, so I went and painted them over with a brush instead. The medallions had all dried, and I put the silver outline on the remaining sides. Once everything had dried, I removed the outside bits of the acetate sheet. Then each medallion gets a diamond strung onto the fishing line. After that, I added the gold tips to each medallion. Then to finish them up, each one gets a set of 2 lobster clasps, one of them tied to the fishing line. With that, the medallions are finished. These took a total of 5 hours and 25 minutes, minus drying time. Next, I move on to the earrings. I follow the same concept of the medallions with using the acetate sheets for the tiny details. I start with the blue paint. Then I move on to silver. Next, I cut the foam bits. They won't be outlining the earrings like the medallions do, but they'll provide stability. I taped down the pieces to a sheet of paper and then painted them silver. Once they dried, they get glued to the sheet, once again using super glue. After that, I cut them out from the acetate. The paint gets applied to the other side. Now I take a thin wire to glue between the top pieces, and this wire will attach to the fish hook earrings. Once those are attached, the earrings are done. The earrings took a total of 1 hour and 15 minutes, minus drying time. Finally, we move on to the shoes. First things first, I put some gel inserts into the front end of the shoes for comfort and to prevent slip. Then I put the shoes on as well as the bodysuit to get an accurate measurement of the size of the shoes. I used my stretchy test fabric to shape around the shoe. This first piece is only for the top part of the shoes. Once the shape was accomplished, I outlined the shape with a permanent marker. Now I take the fabric and transfer it to paper with my pattern wheel. Then I draw over what was transferred to make a pattern, using 1/2-inch seam allowance as usual. For the sole of the shoes, I took non-stretchy fabric, in this case I used muslin, and traced the bottom piece. The same process is done for transferring the pattern to paper. The top of the shoes are cut from the same fabric used for the outer side of the bodysuit pieces and the front of the mantle. As for the soles, those get cut from a stiff pleather. I used this fabric on the Bayonetta 1 hair sleeves. Next I mark where the stretch fabric meets the heel so that I know to leave it unstitched. Then I pin the back of each shoe to stitch there. I also attach the soles to stitch to the boots. Once that is finished, I slip the boot covers over the shoes. Following that, I hem the top of the shoes. After all the stitching is done, it's time to glue the soles down so the boot covers don't fall off the shoes. I also glue down the back of the heels as well. I put the shoes back on to know where the bottom strap meets the front point so it can be glued down. Next, I move on to the paint, using the same method as the suit and mantle. Here I only begin with the toes and the lines up the center of each foot. The rest will be painted on later. Here's where I may have lost some footage relating to the design on the heels. By the time I got to cutting the foam out, I had already glued these same shapes seen here in plastic canvas onto the heels. The foam pieces get glued on top of the existing canvas. For the designs on the heels, I started by drawing all the spots that were indented with permanent marker. Then I took my glue gun and put raised areas in the white around the marked parts. This was what I had come up with for being pressed for time, but it seemed to work just fine. After they dried, I painted silver onto them. I didn't have the correct paint with me, so I had to use the fabric paint, sadly, which was very thick for this process. I had already arrived at the hotel at this point, so there was no going back. I worked on the other two sides of the heels once I'd finished the first two I started. The marker showed through, so I had to paint over them a second time. After that, I finished off the rest of the paint on the shoes. With that, the shoes are complete. Testing methods aside, the shoes took about 2 hours and 57 minutes. I really enjoyed how the gloves turned out. The chains are a little hard to mess with, but the idea worked in the end. The ruffles looked perfect, and I was glad that my weird methods worked. And as can be seen here, the gloves can be easily removed for ease of function. The medallions worked great too. On close inspection you can see the acetate sheet that holds it all together, but I think it worked better than anything else I could have come up with. The earrings are a bit fragile and perhaps not as neatly designed, but they worked well too and were comfortably light. Everyone loved the shoes at Con, and despite them not yet working out with the guns, I too like how they turned out. They were difficult, but in the end they were fine, and I was able to wear them for a good amount of time at Con. Thanks for watching, and until next time, stay whimsical.